You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Dolphins fans. Welcome to another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow along with the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and follow along at DolphinsTalk.com. I am sorry for the early winter hibernation. It's been about a month or so, maybe a little more than a month since the last episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. But we are back now that the Dolphins have settled in with their coaching staff for the 2024 season, and wanted to kind of dive into new defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver and his philosophy a little bit more in depth for this episode. I will be going to the NFL Combine next week, actually a week from today as I record this on Tuesday. I'll be there the 27th. I can't remember which one, but one of the two between Mike McDaniel and Chris Greer speaks that day. So we'll have that to look forward to, and then getting to talk with some of my good friends, including Mr. Travis Wingfield, who will be up there on behalf of the Dolphins themselves, and should be a fun time, and hopefully we'll have a better idea of the Dolphins off-season philosophy after that meeting. Sort of touched on the things that I think they needed to get better at before they moved on from Vic Fangio, especially from an offensive perspective. So this episode will strictly be about the defense, the philosophy, and some of the schematic stuff. So we will get right into it momentarily. No whiskey segment for this week, but perhaps we'll bring it back next week. Nothing tonight because my beloved Dayton Flyers, the 16th ranked team in the country, play tomorrow night, and we'll probably have a drink or two watching that game as they gear towards their March Madness run. But tonight is all about the Miami Dolphins defense. So just going over the staff, obviously Vic Fangio is gone, Anthony Campanelli is gone, Ronaldo Hill, Sam Madison, all gone. This is the new staff in total. Anthony Weaver is the defensive coordinator. Joe Barry is the linebackers coach. That's inside linebackers and run game coordinator. Brian Duker is the pass game coordinator and secondary coach. And then we have Matthew Araujo, who's a friend of McDaniel's from their days at Yale, is the new cornerbacks coach. Austin Clark remains as defensive line coach. Najee Cotton comes in as the assistant defensive line coach because Kenny Baker departed for Texas. New outside linebackers coach is Ryan Crow, comes over from the Tennessee Titans. Matthew O'Donnell is a defensive assistant. Deshaun Sheed, former Seattle Seahawk, comes over as an assistant defensive backs coach. And then Ryan Slowick was promoted into defensive backs / pass game specialist title. So, a lot of new faces. Only Austin Clark and Ryan Slowick remain from guys who were coaching a position group last year. Matthew Araujo was an assistant cornerbacks coach under Sam Madison, but gets the promotion to the big dog role in the cornerbacks room. That's the defensive staff. Essentially, my general thoughts here are it's a collection of pretty smart guys who have come from similar style defenses. You look at Ryan Crow from Tennessee, Anthony Weaver from Baltimore, Brian Duker from Detroit, all kind of zone-based, or Joe Barry in Green Bay, all zone-based coverage schemes, 3-4 style fronts that can flex into various alignments in the nickel. I think this is very much McDaniel trying to put together a staff with Anthony Weaver that allows the Dolphins to be a little bit more flexible and malleable in terms of changing up what they do on a week-to-week basis. Vic Fangio was pretty static with his defensive fronts, but with disguised coverages and things like that. I think this is sort of Miami's answer to having Steve Spagnuolo kick their ass twice this year. Being more flexible, being able to change, being able to slide fronts, being able to stem fronts. This feels like a shot in the direction of that type of flexibility. Now, Anthony Weaver himself, you can listen to whatever other podcast you like to opine about, why wasn't he promoted in Baltimore out of, I think there's 4 different guys from that staff that are now defensive play callers or a head coach in Mike McDonald's case. I don't really care about the pecking order in Baltimore and what happened. I care about, can he teach, and is he willing to incorporate more nuance than Vic Fangio did last year. I thought there were certain things that Fangio didn't do, in terms of being able to kind of dial up blitzes, in terms of matching Jalen Ramsey onto opponents' number ones, in terms of mixing up some of the coverage stuff and finding different roles for Javon Holland. The over-reliance on guys like Kader Kohu to take on big matchups in the slot. Shifting Andrew Van Ginkel to inside linebacker was a dud move. Not getting Cam Smith developed was a dud move. Channing Tindall has to show something at some point. Not getting him at least some token reps, I thought was kind of a weird thing. And then not mixing up the fronts. We pretty much lived in a 4-2 nickel front with stand-up edges most of the year. I don't necessarily think that'll be the case this year under Anthony Weaver. But if you look at it strictly from a schematic standpoint, if you're looking at the all-22 view, a lot of the formations are going to look pretty similar to what we saw under Vic Fangio and even to what we saw under Josh Boyer post-Bradley Chubb trade in mid-22. So I wanted to break this up into kind of a couple different parts to this podcast, and it won't be a super lengthy episode, but I'll do my best to describe as much detail as I can from having watched a couple Baltimore games and talked to a couple of the guys that I consider defensive gurus. The overall philosophy of this defense, you talked about, Anthony Weaver himself talked about it in his introductory press conference, that Romeo Crennel was his primary influence. He's also spent time working under Dean Pease. Both of those guys were in New England with Bill Belichick. And then he's also worked under Rex Ryan. Also worked under Mike Pettin, who worked under Rex Ryan. And there's some transitive stuff there. Rex Ryan's third down package was ultimately copied by Nick Saban at Alabama. And Nick Saban lent that to Bill Belichick, who created the 5-0 front with the New England Patriots out of Rex Ryan's 3-2 dime package. So a lot of similarities. And overall, it's going to be a nickel-heavy defense, just like last year. That's what the NFL is nowadays. But the principles are rooted in sort of the early 2000s New England Patriots. We're going to have big, heavy defensive linemen, strong edge rushers, and try and funnel everything inside and just mash you and be able to play different variations of coverages to suit our needs on a game planning basis. And there's even, and this will be kind of a more obscure reference because people don't remember it or associate it very much, there's some Marvin Lewis stuff in there back from when he was the coordinator of the 2000s Ravens, that vaunted defense, and some of the stuff that Marvin Lewis took to Cincinnati when he was the head coach there. Typically what you're going to see is if they do line up in a base front, their traditional group, and when I say base front, I'm talking the base traditional personnel, 4 DBs plus 7 front defenders. It's generally a 3-4 defense where you're looking at a 4-eye, a zero technique, and another 4-eye. Pretty traditional, doesn't really differ much from what we saw under Brian Flores, Josh Boyer, or Vic Fangio. About the one exception I can think of is I think it was 2021 when the Patriots had Cam Newton. Miami actually played true 5 techniques because the Patriots had incorporated some option stuff. That's about the one deviation we've seen out of this defensive style really since Matt Burke was the defensive coordinator last in 2018. There are going to be some times where they shade and play an over or an under front in a 3-4 look. There will be some two-gapping, especially when they shade techniques to play an inside or outside shoulder rather than the head-up stuff. One of the unique things about this defense, and this traces its roots back to Buddy Ryan in the 4-6 defense with the Chicago Bears in the 80s. But Rex Ryan ran this when he was the head coach of the Jets. Marvin Lewis ran this style of defense a lot, if not all of the time when he was with the Cincinnati Bengals. They will actually line up in a 4-3 under front. And not to get too confusing, because I've seen a bunch of articles out of there about how 3-4 defenses are really a 4-3 under defense, just with the defensive end standing up. You can run an under front out of 3-4 looks the same as you can out of 4-3 looks. So it's not exactly the same. The interesting thing with that, if you go back to Rex Ryan's history when he was the defensive coordinator in Baltimore and then as the head coach with the Jets, Bill Belichick did this with Vince Wilfork when he was in New England. I believe certainly Dean Pease was there at least some of the time Wilfork was there. I believe Cornell may have been as well. But one of the interesting things that they will do is they will take their nose tackle and then shift him to play 3 technique or as a big end in these 4-3 under packages. The most notable one is Rex Ryan using Haloti Ngata from the Baltimore Ravens to do it. They also used Brandon Williams in that capacity after Rex Ryan had moved on to become the Jets coach. He did it in New York with Sione Puha when he was there. As we mentioned, the Patriots did it with Vince Wilfork. So that's one of the interesting things. And if you're looking for like a more modern example, look at the 2013 Legion of Boom Seahawks. They would play Red Bryant, who was a backup nose tackle at 6'4", 322 pounds. They would play him as their base end in 4-3 fronts and let Chris Clemens act as a stand-up Sam rusher next to him. And then the underfront essentially means you're playing the nose tackle and your strong side end to the offense's strong side. So there's fewer guys on the strong side, but they're typically bigger people. And then you're playing fewer guys, but smaller people on the backside to counter that with speed to try and develop a free hitter, which traces its roots back to like Jimmy Johnson with the Cowboys and then previously with the Miami Hurricanes when he was a college coach. That will linebacker becomes a free hitter, which is what you're trying to devise when you do that with the 4-3 under. Baltimore last year, their primary personnel group was 3-3 personnel running a 4-2 nickel front with stand-up edge guys. So essentially the same look that we saw with Fangio. Kind of the one difference is Baltimore is running it out of a true wide 9 front where you've got a 5, a 2-eye, a 3, and a 9. Whereas Fangio would sometimes have a 1 technique or a shade and play that 5 as a true 5 instead of a wide 5. So that's a little bit different. I think this makes it a little bit easier as a defense to try and protect your gaps and be able to fall off them against the run rather than having that 5 technique end play a little tighter into the ball. So you've got some nuances there that are a little bit different. The biggest change you're going to notice up front is, I guess, depending on personnel and what happens with certain guys in Miami. Baltimore typically has used a bigger, true nose tackle type of body. They had Michael Pierce, who's like 6 foot and 350 some pounds. Brandon Williams was there before that, who was 6'2", 340. Haloti Ngata was an absolute monster of a human being. They've always kind of had that bigger type defensive tackle. The Dolphins really don't have that. And I know people will say, well, they got Brandon Pilley, who's 6'3" and 320. While true, he's never played a true nose tackle set. He's always been in a 4-3 front in college at USC. And obviously didn't fare very well with the Dolphins. I think he was off the active roster by week 3 or 4, if my memory serves there. So it can be very flexible. They will run some fronts that will look like, if you go back to Brian Flores, Josh Boyer pre-Bradley Chubb trade, you'll see some of the 3-3 jack front stuff. I believe the Patriots call that their diamond front, where you've got essentially a 3 technique, a 0, a 3 technique, and then your outside linebackers are walked up playing 5s with one off-ball linebacker directly behind the nose. You will see that some. Really, since we've acquired Bradley Chubb, that look has kind of disappeared, regardless of whether it was Josh Boyer or Vic Fangio. So that gives you a chance to kind of mix up the front a little bit. Their nose tackle, predominantly in that nickel package, even though it's a bigger body guy, is typically playing a 2-eye technique, which is the inside shoulder of the guard, or playing a straight 2 technique, which you really only see in some of these wide 9 fronts where you're playing head up on a guard and basically 2-gapping, being responsible for an A gap and a B gap. So while Baltimore typically has used a bigger body nose tackle, the Dolphins, both with Christian Wilkins, should they bring him back, and Zach Sealer, both did this last year under Fangio and did it the year before under Boyer. So they've got experience doing it, even though the bigger of the two of those guys, Christian Wilkins, is only 310 pounds. So if they do bring Christian Wilkins back, you can probably still run this defense functionally and be fine, despite not having that true big-bodied, 325-pound plus nose tackle type. Not too worried about that. Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips should fit in just fine. If they were to bring back Andrew Van Ginkel, he should fit in just fine as an edge player. Now, here's where some of the cool stuff kind of comes in that we didn't see with Fangio, or at least not to the degrees that I would have expected us to see with Fangio. The number one thing, and this comes from the Romeo Crennel, especially from the Rex Ryan influence, and especially from Mike McDonald, who was the Ravens D coordinator last year, now the Seahawks head coach, and that's simulated pressures. This was something that Rex Ryan relied on a ton when he was the head coach of the New York Jets. Kind of the one difference is Rex Ryan would purposely overload sides of the formation to make you think someone was coming, and then bring guys from the other side and drop into coverage. Makes it a little tough just based on the amount of yardage you have to travel if you're aligned on one side of the ball versus the other, or that exaggerated the way the Jets did it. But he did have a pretty unique philosophy, his foot fetish aside. But he was very good about figuring out, okay, if I show this to a smart quarterback like a Tom Brady or a Peyton Manning, if I show him an overload, he's going to lick his chops because he's going to know how to throw right behind it with a hot route. But if I show this to someone like, I think he used Joey Harrington was a specific example from back when he was with the Ravens. If I show that to Joey Harrington, he's going to piss down his leg because he knows pressure's coming and he doesn't know how to fix it and how to attack it. So with some of those smarter quarterbacks, you have to show them one thing and do another, whereas with other guys, you can simulate it and then just actually bring it, or show them a pressure, get him to panic and drop into coverage and force him into a bad decision. We'll certainly see a lot more of that out of Anthony Weaver with some of the stuff that they do. One of the interesting things that kind of ties into that is the Ravens last year tended to have great, I'll call it throttle control, for lack of a better term, in terms of the frequency with which they blitzed. There's a great stat I got from a friend of mine. They played the Bengals, I believe it was week 2. So early in the season when Joe Burrow was still playing, the Ravens blitzed on 3% of the snaps in that game because they had been burned time and time again by Burrow, especially under Wink Martindale, who would blitz till he was blue in the face, and the Bengals would just shred the Ravens. They only blitzed 3% of the time against Joe Burrow, and then 2 weeks later against the Browns, which I can't remember if it was Deshaun Watson or the Browns had shifted to a backup quarterback. Whatever the case was, the Ravens smelled blood in the water, and they sent guys on like 68% of the snaps in that game. And really the only times we saw Fangio even kind of dial up blitzes last year were the last 2 games of the season when, you were out without Chubb, without Phillips, and then you lost Van Ginkel going into the playoffs. And basically it was just sort of Fangio living and dying by the blitz trying to affect Patrick Mahomes. And obviously it didn't work. I think the Dolphins this year will exercise much better throttle control with blitzing. They'll know when to dial it up a little better and know when to be more conservative and play coverage. One of the other interesting things that Baltimore did, and this is something that Rex Ryan did a lot of in New York, that you didn't see a whole bunch of from the New England Patriots influence early on. You kind of saw it post-2010 when they invented their 5-0 front, which again is based off of Rex Ryan's 3-2 dime front. But Baltimore likes to mug their inside linebackers up. And with Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen, it's pretty easy to kind of get caught up in all the different things you can have those guys do because they're such good athletes, Smith especially. But that sort of thing was not something we saw the Dolphins do a bunch of last year. I apologize for the background noises. You can probably hear my co-host, my unofficial co-host, our pit lab, Chloe, making herself right at home here in the studio. But Baltimore did a lot of various things with mugging their linebackers, and then Miami flashed this blitz a couple times, mostly with David Long, if I remember correctly, where Baltimore did this a lot, where they would take one inside linebacker, slide the front down, and make the inside linebacker the new edge linebacker. Works pretty well when you've got guys as fast and athletic as Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. I think David Long got a pressure or a sack off of this last year. Jerome Baker obviously has extensive experience doing this in the past under Brian Flores. But it's something to keep in mind as a way to play around with pressures and simulated pressures. And there's even times when Baltimore will do this where they'll just simply walk that inside backer down off the edge to try and force you to fan a protection and then do some kind of stunt or game away from them fanning that protection, which is kind of dirty. They did some coffee house blitzes. Do yourself a favor and look up what that is. It would be cool to see Miami incorporate that. I think, obviously Jerome Baker's situation is up in the air, but you can do some of that stuff with David Long. Even Channing Tindall's got experience doing it at the University of Georgia. So just something to keep in mind. Another interesting is a lot of times when they show these sim pressures or overloaded pressures where they're coming to one side, they're not always bringing pressure. They're trying to create the illusion that they're bringing pressure, but typically they're only rushing 4 still. They're just trying to make you guess where those 4 guys are actually coming from. And they sure don't seem to be afraid about undersized linebackers maintaining gap integrity and being able to fight off, bigger offensive linemen. David Long, kind of the same boat last year, despite being 5'11", 227. he can stand up to some big linemen just fine and get into gaps. I would be more worried about Jerome Baker and that aspect. Despite his size, I would also be worried about Andrew Van Ginkel. He was not very good at coming off blocks from off-ball positions last year. Much better on the edge. But with that kind of flexibility and in blitz incorporation where you're bringing an off-ball guy to the edge, if you brought back Andrew Van Ginkel, maybe that's a job that he would fill pretty well in that role. Coverage stuff. A lot of it's going to be based on that New England early 2000s stuff, which is a lot of cover 1 and cover 3. But there's a multiple zone-based look similar to Vic Fangio. And I think this is where Brian Duker comes in. There's a ton of 3 safety looks from the Ravens last year. Obviously, they had Kyle Hamilton, who's a tremendous defender. They have Marcus Williams as their deep safety, and they'll play some split safety looks. And then Geno Stone was kind of the unofficial strong safety. Anthony Weaver already hinted at this in his introductory press conference that they're going to move Jalen Ramsey around. Jalen Ramsey played sort of that big nickel role for the Rams prior to coming to the Dolphins via trade. That's something I think you'll see him do quite a bit of in this defense, just with the flexibility that they have to run it. You may see some scenarios where Javon Holland becomes that guy. He did it at the University of Oregon. He actually did it for a few snaps in the regular season finale against Buffalo. I think they tried to get him to play in that role just to alleviate some of the injury risk at safety, and then he ended up taking himself out of the game. Rough end of the way to end that season. But you can see the flexibility there that this scheme can benefit. With 3 safeties, Miami certainly would have to make some additions. They only have 1 under contract for next year. That's Javon Holland. Interesting to note that Deshaun Elliott played under Brian Duker and played in Baltimore prior to playing in Detroit under Anthony Weaver. And then the Lions also released veteran Tracy Walker today. He can sign with another team now because he was cut prior to the start of the league year in March. So that's an interesting potential veteran addition the Dolphins may look into making. Certainly going to have to do something in the secondary to team with Javon Holland. Now, let's get this out of the way. I don't think that Holland and or Jalen Ramsey is an analog to Kyle Hamilton, but you could use them similarly in certain situations. If it's something where you want to play more coverage, you'd use Jalen Ramsey in the slot. If it's something where you want to still have kind of an overhang defender who can play the run against the box, you're probably more inclined to use Javon Holland there, even though Jalen Ramsey's a pretty good tackler. If you don't believe me, go back and watch some of his Rams film, especially from 2020 and 2021. The interesting thing that couples off of that, though, is what do you do with Kader Kohou? In my eyes, he's not good enough to be a full-time boundary or field corner on the perimeter. He's just not good enough in deep coverage going back to put out there a ton. I think you could do it against certain opponents, and certainly Miami did that last year and won games with Kohou doing it. Obviously, it sounds like Xavier Howard's probably not going to be here given his financial situation. So that sort of opens the door to Cam Smith. And I talked about this last year to look at Cam Taylor-Britt in Cincinnati as kind of the example. Bengals drafted him in the 2nd round. He wasn't slated to be a starter, didn't play much. Then Chidobe Awuzie got hurt. This was actually 2 years ago. And Cam Taylor-Britt took that spot and became a starter all of this past season as well. Cam Smith is kind of in the same boat. Had first-round talent, fell to the 2nd round. It is true. The rumors about Fangio not liking him, that is very real. I would consider Cam Smith, just give him a clean slate in your eyes as a fan. And I really think the same thing of Channing Tindall as well, depending on what they do at off-ball linebacker. have to figure out a way to get him involved, and I think certainly there's an opportunity as a blitzer if he shows an aptitude for picking up the playbook. Now, one of the more interesting things that the Ravens were able to do last year is when you're playing a lot of these zone drops, you're having, especially your underneath coverage, your nickel, your linebackers, maybe even an edge guy at times, are spot dropping to certain areas of the field. And one thing that Baltimore was especially good at last year was sort of what I would call like heat map dropping, where they're dropping into places where quarterbacks throw the ball quite frequently. And we saw that happen against our very own Miami Dolphins late in the season, where they spot dropped over the middle and Tua threw it into double coverage and threw a pick. They were very good at being able to drop right where receivers make their breaks out of their routes. So whatever mechanism Baltimore had for devising that, whether it's coaching, film study, combination, whether that's McDonald, Weaver, someone else, they did a very good job of being able to organize how they spot dropped their underneath coverages. Certainly better than what Miami did. And David Long got better as the season wore on, but wasn't that great. Jerome Baker had his moments. A lot of people say, well, Van Ginkel was a good coverage player. Yeah, off the edge, he was good at dropping into the flat and reading hook to curl. Wasn't very good over the middle. So that's an area where Miami's going to have to improve. And then finally, we'll wrap it up by looking at some possible needs, just players I would keep my eye on as it relates to the Dolphins. If you're looking for that true big body nose tackle, I guess this is sort of operating under the assumption that Christian Wilkins doesn't come back in this scenario. Quick aside, I do know that they are still trying to work something out in the coming weeks, but we'll see what happens on that front. But if you lose Christian Wilkins and you need that big body nose, DJ Reader from the Bengals is certainly a name to keep an eye on. He played in Houston when Anthony Weaver was there as a defensive line coach. Tavondre Sweat from the University of Texas in the draft, someone to keep an eye on. Safeties, obviously Deshaun Elliott would be a good one to re-sign. Tracy Walker, who was cut, Cam Kinchins from the University of Miami would be a great one to add as sort of a deep guy that allows you to play Javon Holland closer to the line of scrimmage. Edge defenders, I think Miami's going to have to make at least one or two mercenary signings here. Obviously, Jadeveon Clowney played under Weaver last year in Baltimore. Clowney's always been a really good run stopper, had 9.5 sacks last year, which is a career high for him, or tied a career high for him. Kyle Van Noy was in Baltimore. I think he had 7 or 8 sacks a year ago as an edge guy who also has experience playing off-ball stuff, can do that kind of role for you. I would look at anyone who came from that Baltimore system. Tyus Bowser would be another one. Guys like that, or edge guys from Green Bay that have experience with Joe Barry, would be guys that I would look at in terms of fits for this defense. I think ultimately your biggest piece towards unlocking this is what happens with Christian Wilkins. Do you have him back or do you not? And you can kind of build out your defensive personnel from there. All this to say, as I've had several people ask me, am I excited by the Anthony Weaver hiring? And my answer to that is no. But it's not for the reason you think. I'm not excited because I think the prevailing word I would term with Vic Fangio is disappointing. Had a top 10 defense in a lot of respects, especially if you take away the points that were given up by the offense, special teams that aren't attributable to the defense. They would have had the 10th ranked defense in terms of points allowed per game and total points overall. Pretty good mixture of defense, but the stuff that he didn't do, the strange proclivities with personnel and kind of how he clashed with the personnel department, just kind of a disappointing thing. For someone who's been in coaching that long, you would have thought maybe more tools would be brought to bear in terms of deploying the defense to the utmost potential. Not using Emmanuel Ogbah, who had, like 5.5 sacks and an interception in like 25% of the total defensive snaps. People want to rave about Andrew Van Ginkel. He had 6 sacks and 1 interception and played a whole hell of a lot more. So to me, Anthony Weaver, it doesn't move the needle, which to me is a good thing. Like, I think it's offering a pretty good chance to stave off as much of the regression that I think is sort of scheduled to happen. It's going to stave off as much of that as possible if this is a big if, they get their personnel decisions right, because they're going to have some attrition. You're going to lose somebody to be able to do all the things you want to do in totality with the roster, including Tua's extension. Do you work out deals for guys like Javon Holland, David Long, some of those guys that are still under contract that are coming due after 2024. Christian Wilkins, Tua Tagovailoa, obviously the big question marks. You're going to have some personnel attrition, and on top of that, odds are you're not going to have Bradley Chubb until late in the season, and it's still questionable whether or not Jalen Phillips will be there at the start. But I think this scheme, this group of coaches, allow you the opportunity to have some continuity from what Vic Fangio was doing schematically, especially in your predominantly used nickel packages and coverage schemes. And it allows you, in my opinion, it's trying to get as many smart guys into the room to tweak the defense enough to where you can be even more game plan specific. Maybe there's certain weeks where you can afford to let Jalen Ramsey just kind of eliminate half the field on defense. And there's other weeks where you put him in the slot or have him follow a team's number one. Be interesting to see how this shakes out, but I think the personnel and the additions we make between now and I guess when you have like summer mini camps start, that'll give us a little bit better picture of what the blueprint could be on defense. But hopefully this was at least informative for you, and you enjoyed learning a little bit about Anthony Weaver's background and how the Ravens deployed some of their personnel last year and how that meshes with what the Dolphins had been doing both under Josh Boyer and especially under Vic Fangio. That's going to do it for this week's episode. I will hope to have another episode up sometime in the next 10 days, kind of recapping my trip to Indy for the Combine. Please follow the show at DolphinsTalk.com, as well as iTunes, Spotify, and follow me, Kevin Dern, on Twitter. My handle is @KevinMD4. Thank you guys for listening, and fins up.